Hey everybody, I'm Tommy, and this is the second video in the build series of videos for the MicroShop project. Whether it's your first time here, or even if you've been here before, welcome to 1 Minute Workbench. So in this video, I'm going to cover mounting the circular saw into the main cabinet in order to create a temporary table saw to help complete building the project before the actual table saw is finished. I flipped the cabinet over and just loosely set the circular saw in the approximate location where it would eventually reside and trace the base. If you remember from part 1, I didn't actually glue this piece. I just attached it with a few pins and a series of screws. I removed the series of screws and the 4 pins that were holding it, and then set it on some sacrificial scrap material. Using a large framing square, I started working to square up the saw's base with the outer edge of the piece of plywood. I added 1 screw in one corner through the saw's base into the plywood. The hole in the piece of metal is just big enough for the screw to fit through. However, the hole in the plywood is smaller than the screw and acts just as a pilot hole. This is so that the threads will take hold. With only 1 screw in place, the saw can still pivot. This allowed me to use the framing square to once again align the saw's base perfectly square with the outside edge of the plywood. Once I had it perfectly square, I added a couple of screws to hold it in place. I noticed, however, that the screws tended to shift the base and were pulling it out of square. So I added a couple of small blocks to make sure it couldn't move. I then realized that the blocks I used were just a bit too wide, so I trimmed them down to size with a small handsaw. With the blocks holding the saw perfectly square, I continued adding screws through the saw's base into the plywood top until it was very secure. I elevated the saw and plunged the blade through the plywood top, being careful not to cut into anything below it. I then removed these protruding pin nails that had come through when I was securing the alignment blocks in place. I also checked the squareness of the blade just to be sure before I moved on with the rest of the project. I added the plywood top back to the assembly and reinserted the series of screws that hold the top in place. Using a hacksaw blade as a flush cut saw, I removed the tips of the screws that were protruding through the top and then filed them down with a flat file. Once they were perfectly flush and smooth, I set the unit on top of these sawhorses where it would remain for pretty much the remainder of the project. I also tested out the strength of the unit with my favorite method, which is standing on top of it to see if it'll hold my weight. In order to have a temporary switch for the saw, I zip-tied the saw's trigger in the on position and then plugged it into a plug strip with a switch. As a temporary fence, I just used the piece that I had cut for the bottom cover of the unit, which is part G for those of you who've purchased the plans. Using a simple ruler, I placed the temporary fence a specific distance from the inside edge of the blade and made sure to measure it from both ends of the blade to get it set at a consistent distance. I clamped it in place and cut a couple of strips of wood. As you can see here, the cut is nearly perfect, being off by only about 0.02 of an inch, about the same thickness as a human hair. And the edges were perfectly square as well. At that point, I started working on the miter gauge for the table saw. The miter gauge and the table saw's fence will be the subject of part 3 of this video series. Be sure to check the description section below for links to the other videos in this build series. Hey, thanks for watching. I really hope you liked this video. If you haven't already, be sure to like and subscribe, and make sure you hit the bell icon so you get notified every time there's a new episode. I'd love to hear what you think of this MicroShop project in the comment section below. And if you have any quick questions you want answered, hit me up on Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter. And until the next time I see you, I hope you have fun building something.